description of the rest of the amphibian. In other words, we can ask them to do a literature review on how good are these two creatures at being proxies for the rest of them in terms of work practices. Because I think you are right that like when we have a direction, let's go with that direction. And two, like it helps us to prioritize things. But if we're leaving out large parts of the landscape and not looking at them because we're just focused on these two, it seems unwise. But the literature review doesn't get us there without having the like having to be part of the whole bit of research question.
If I call those, if I just refer to HCP species, is that clear enough or?
Covered species is what we call them
Okay.
in the HCP.
Hearing or seeing the head nodding to Josh's comment, and I just want to make sure I can pick up. I know where, oh.
What I wanted to check is the comment appropriately captured and does it say what Julie's agreed to?
Yeah.
And its habitat has been well studied, so locations of overlapping. Does that get the gist of what everybody was thinking?
So I have that more as
well protected than well studied.
Okay. Oh, yeah, I didn't see what you're saying.
Yeah, it just didn't quite seem to. Sorry, Stacy.
Oh, no, that's okay.
I wanted to make sure it was.
yeah, no, that wasn't quite the point, but an important point. But I think what I heard as sort of like the part of what you were saying, Josh, was that there's an interest in looking at all the covered species and understanding, here's in my head, this is the literature review, but understanding the habitat requirements and the current status.
And distribution.
Sure.
Yeah, I can go. Sarah, I was thinking about sending it to you in a Teams chat, but I don't want to. For the meeting. I can just send you kind of like questions in
Yeah.
the Teams chat.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Yes.
Sarah, would it be okay to
Copy
start a
and
new
paste.
bullet?
Copy and
Yes.
yeah. Yeah, so what were the habitat requirements, what's the current status of populations? What do we know about the events? Question. But they sent it to you. I don't wish to you specifically, so.
Yeah, that would help a lot.
You might be able to pull up this. Wow.
So I think, yeah, those two chunks, I think where we could go, so just want to make sure that we're all in that. Sorry, Sarah.
No, thank you for being patient.
So basically, yeah, there's
Like
like
catch up if you want to.
the habitat requirements, the current status, in my mind falls a little bit in what we might ask IRST to do in a literature review. I guess that was what I was trying to say by the like, what do we know?
Yes.
Yeah,
So just for me to be clear on, that I think would be helpful. So the IRST is gonna do a lit review no matter what, like that's part of their scope of proposal
right.
process. Are you, when you talk about them doing a lit review, you're talking about something in addition to that or in replacement of that?
no,
or
I'm just trying to clarify because there's a lot of questions we've raised that I think could be answered in the literature review. So I'm just trying to like move us into that second phase, which is our real question.
Right, okay.
Yeah, because there's things that we don't know about these species, but I think can be answered in that first step.
So I think it's a bit helpful to provide some specificity about what we want from the literature review, because like you said, just amphibian. So, these three questions we really want.
The sort of core question, which both Josh and Amanda and others have phrased in various ways, but it's essentially like how forest practices impact the persistence of those populations. Which I think then we could still further refine, but
Yeah.
I just want to do sort of a thumbs up, thumbs down, maybe, maybe that could be a separate bullet, Sarah, sorry. No, sorry. I'm used to facilitating and also typing, so sometimes it's hard to translate from my brain to the,
Yeah, I do wanna push back on the framing of that last question a little bit, because like personally, and the folks that I represent, I think we're more interested in knowing how old forest practices compare to new forest practices versus how does forest management activities affect habitat negatively? From a policy standpoint, I think it's, you know, if you drive a car through a stream, you're gonna impact, right? I mean, I think that having that activity, if the question is worded in the way that it just was, then yes, the answer is yes, forest management activities have an effect, right? And have that effect that we wanna know about, but I think that the more focused question is really, is the HCP as drafted in the forest practices as we have them, and you know, the new forest practice rule set, is it impacting in a good way, right? Is there a positive correlation to habitat compared to before? That's what I'm really interested in, right? Yes, I want to know the kind of the meat and potatoes of, you know, what are the habitat needs? But I would rather, and I think what I'm getting at is kind of like we did with the hydrologic connectivity. It's like, you know, baseline versus, you know, looking at watersheds or treatment areas that utilize old practices versus ones that are now utilizing the new practices. And from an adaptive management perspective, that's what I'm interested in, right? And I don't know exactly how to get there, but hopefully I've spurred enough interest in, I've just read that.
Yeah,
Brothers.
and then to clarify, that's why I said specific forest practices, because I wanna know not just the old versus new, but like, what are the different setups that have been researched and how do those different setups behave? So like pre-PFA forest practices, I would include as a specific set of forest practices. Current would be a specific set of forest practices. What's North Idaho doing might be another one. Somebody that's done a lot of work there, you know, what's happening in Western Washington, Eastern Washington might be another one. That's why I was trying to capture that in specific forest practices rather than just, you know, trying like blanket statements.
Yeah. I took that to mean like, is this way that we do it now better than this way that we do it now? Which kind of gets into that initial conversation that we had a long time ago, where I was really concerned about getting too prescriptive with the way that we answer questions leading to rule changes that prescribe how the people that I represent have to do their job. Right. But I just didn't want it to go that direction, and it was in 30s, 50s, clearly.
Yeah.
So could we amend that very last bullet, Sarah? How would you?
About the literature review though, I mean, you were talking about the literature review,
Yeah.
just to clarify.
Yeah.
At least Josh's response to Amanda was with regard to the literature.
Okay.
And if it isn't, then I'll have a comment.
So would that be tied in with the lit review then?
Yeah, it wasn't.
I mean, yeah, I think there might be further research that needs to be done.
I think some of this is getting into like the methodologies, right? And the specific literature, or the specific research design, but it's ensuring, and to me, it's ensuring that there's you know, covariance and, you know, things that are researched that this is kind of like how I asked this question during the field trip of how they're stratifying, right? Like, are they stratifying and looking at data from certain types of management on certain types of land ownerships differently than others? And are they separating data out in those ways? Which I think they will in the future. It sounded like they aren't necessarily right now. I think that is where we need to go.
Yeah, I think you have to, in order to have size bill.
Yeah.
Lisa and then Casey.
Great. So just a quick comment and then a question. So my comment is just so you guys know, the camera in the room there is going black on those of us.
I
that-
know, we've been trying to fix it and to no avail.
Okay, so
Sorry.
my question is, and it kind of goes back to something I asked earlier with regarding, existing scientific information around riparian areas in general and how that might tie back to. So we've got, I think, Josh's comment up there, we're talked about salmon habitat. We've got it talking about first order stream, but it also plays into this last comment here around how current forest practice affect persistence of these amphibian populations. So if we have good information that ties back to forest practices on some of those riparian conditions, how do those interplay with habitat conditions for amphibians, for example? And how can we use that information for this process?
Yeah, and that's to this, Casey, I think it's a great point because this ties back, I think, to your comment a little while ago before the break about habitat proxies or habitat characteristics versus the actual population too, right? So that probably is something we either want to add IRST for in a literature review or as part of the research question. It's separate from a literature review.
Sorry, you say that one more time. So
Oh.
this is kind of like a not related to the lit review as much.
I think it would be what's the relationship between amphibian populations, where it's not really populations, it's amphibian presence and particular habitat characteristics, right?
Well, I would go beyond.
Oh,
It's just like there's one or there's a million there, that's presence. So,
Yeah.
Yes, I would.
I just put
say population.
population as like a shorthand for
Yeah,
distribution and demographics.
yeah.
So I guess.
Yeah.
Oh, I was sorry, is it?
Go ahead.
I was just gonna also respond to your question about the current versus old. And it was different with the research question around hydrologic connectivity because we were asking about baseline and also there wasn't an immediate flip from 0 to 1 in terms of forest practices, right? I mean, you know that around road connectivity and disconnectivity, hydrologic connection. And in this case, there's new forest practices that affect amphibians across the whole scale. And for the most part, it is a 0 to 1 pre and post. So we're not really living in the old PFA in that regard. And our question is, this before coming back, I think, to your repeated comments is, are the current forest practices rules, right? And the forest practices that are associated with the rules effective at promoting the persistence of populations or impacting the persistence of populations. So in terms of, I think, well, the goal of the HCP and the goal of the BGOs, right, is to promote that persistence.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm getting at there is it would be interesting to know if there is persistence and presence of the species where we didn't have these rules, we didn't have ELZs before, right? And now we do, like, that's interesting to know. If they were persisting in that environment, then we're trying to learn from an adaptive management from within the adaptive management framework of what is applying pressure on these species life histories, right? And so is it predation by a different species? Does it have to do with forest practices? Is it multiple things, right? And so I guess by not looking at any sort of a baseline or not looking at what watersheds and streams that utilized a different set of activities and practices, we can't really judge. It's harder to judge on what might be affecting the life history of that species, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. And so I just wanted, like, I want to know that, right? Like, I want to know, it's just another piece of information for us to be able to make good policy decisions about.
So you're wanting to capture, answer your question, you're wanting to capture. Comparison between
Mhm.
Yeah, so we're talking about the same thing, we're
Yeah.
just using different
Yeah.
language for it, like wanting to know.
Mhm.
Oregon passed, right? If I were in Washington, so. if we capture that we want like forest management regimes. Or it's sort of a difference
Yeah.
between those different forest management approaches.
What we care about is the species. And the species' ability to survive. Not just the habitat, like having a lot of habitat doesn't always mean that a species is doing well. We've seen that with spotted owl, right? Like if we build it, they will come, well, we built it and they didn't really come, right? So I wanna make sure that we're thinking about that, that it is really about the species, not just about the habitat over there.
And just to make this is not just us, but it's not the literature review, you're speaking to like a broader research question,
Yeah.
right? So,
Yeah, I'm trying to get sort of beyond the literature review.
yeah.
Cause I think the literature review is gonna help us understand a lot more about the current knowledge of the demographic pieces, right? I mean, I think that's gonna help us a lot, knowing more about those pieces. But at some point, we have to get beyond that, recognize the known unknowns, right? Which we're trying to get at. And then try to figure out, well, what do we actually want to study and research when it comes to the actual research proposal, right?
So would it, to sort of synthesize both of your points, that be like the last question, how do current forest practices affect resistance? But should there be a sub-bullet there that, I think how you just phrased it, Josh, the comparison between different management regimes, so maybe you have it up there, yeah, the pre and post PFA, that sort of, it's not just current, but also understanding different pre, post, other states, federal,
Yeah, and
that,
I think the lit review, its job would be to like, what's the current state of knowledge on that?
Yeah.
And then the research question piece of it is, where do we go from there to add on it, and what are the specific questions we need to? So it kind of goes into both the lit review
Yeah.
and then kind of the lit review, and we're formulating questions, now what? Because, maybe the literature review can answer some of that, and maybe it can't. But then once we kind of know that, then we can formulate more specific questions to get to what it meant down. Just like, how are we doing compared to what we used to be doing, and how does that affect species, persistence of population?
And I just wanna add, I think the first question with that is, where are they? Right, and that's sort of what they're trying to get at with the research design that we reviewed on the Weyerhaeuser property, right? It's like, well, where are they, right? Because, and within that, it's, you can then extrapolate a little bit of, okay, well, they're here, they're not over here, well, what's different from here versus over there, right? And that's where you start to get into those, well, these utilize the old rules, these ones utilize the new ones, or maybe they both utilize the old, okay, well, and they're here and they're not there, then what's different about this area versus that area? Maybe it has to do with parent material or how inside is the stream, or whatever it is, right? And then you can start to get into those, and that's when we start thinking about even future research questions and future research to build off of this. But I think that first research question really is where are they on the landscape? Just to like really kind of pull that.
yeah, no,
And just to be clear, where are they, I think we talked about this before, because I think I said, where are they, or presence, and you said population, or like population size. So I just want to clarify too, that seems like an important component of it, is that if there's one amphibian, there's one torrent salamander somewhere, we're not necessarily gonna be like, yay, this must be okay, but if we have 1 million, we probably are also gonna go, what's happening here? So just to be like,
synthesize again. I think we not to steal your thunder here, but everybody is sort of coalescing around the where are they? And what I like to add to that is, and what's happening to them over time. So it's not necessarily a one and done question, it's population trends which came up over time and trend monitoring to see what happens. So that we can make some of those comparisons that both Josh and I brought up earlier about the effects of forest practices. Someone said climate change earlier, effects of climate change, things like that really have to come from long-term trend monitoring.
I would say, I would dispute the trend monitoring so much as to say that from a technical, because I think that's the language that.
Oh, those are very different though.
And I'm saying that at least the PFA final report has effectiveness monitoring as our charge, not trend monitoring, so.
We're trying to, but well, so part of effectiveness monitoring would be status and part would be trend.
Yeah, totally, I just clarified, effectiveness monitoring and trend monitoring are different things.
So I think I'm hearing, three questions or possibly a few sub-questions, but essentially we want that first one, how do current forest practices affect the persistence? Maybe it could be bold, that one, just to. This one here, yeah, got one. And then within that, we would want to be, we're interested in different management regimes before the change of rules with the new rules. Then also interested in, and maybe this is the first question, but the distribution question, where are they? And like you said, Megan, what happens to them over time, which I think that's your long-term population monitoring, but yeah, distribution, range and prevalence kind of questions over time. Shorthand that.
Like those are the first priorities or.
Yeah, or some questions. It's not quite like being together into a neat question, but I think that's sort of where we're landing on. Yeah. I see like a thumbs up, down, middle, where that bullet that's bolded. It's not an articulated question, but it's sort of like a potential question. Is that generally looking right? Okay.
I would just caution that main topics probably should be, I wouldn't say the main topics is probably the right thing for that because those don't really reflect the bolded question. They're a subpart of a bolded question.
Yeah.
You know, I feel that like distribution, abundance and demographics are one part of a question of forest practices.
You'll answer the question.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, say what you said.
Oh, no, I just didn't think that main topics, unless there were more pieces to it, main topics wouldn't cover. If you just said that the things that we're going to focus on are distribution, abundance, and demographics, that wouldn't actually answer your question, how do current forest practices affect the persistence of amphibian populations? So I wanted to clarify that you took off main topics, and that was my question. That was my request.
And I don't even know that that's it. I think that distribution maybe is its own question. So sorry, I just don't want to like too much directing your formatting here.
Yeah.
But maybe if you could bump that bullet out and make it bold.
I agree.
Okay. Yes, I concur. Because I think those are the two questions that I'm hearing. If you could pull that distribution bullet, yeah. But those are the two that were sort of emerging. And I guess the question that I had again, and just reflecting back on the private forest recorder report, maybe to that first bolded one, was that in the language there, it does specifically point to riparian buffer prescriptions and steep slope prescriptions. So I'm curious. That doesn't necessarily constrain us to doing those, but I think that there may be the most questions around those prescriptions, and that might help narrow the question in a useful way instead of looking at the full suite of rule changes. Although arguably roads could be on
I
there.
think we have to manage roads, especially when we're talking about crossings and all. Oh, yeah, happening, the stream crossings with the bigger process going forward. Just looking at what Nate was pointing out, where he's like, this road is never gonna not be a disaster, and this crossing is never gonna not be a problem. So I'm probably taking them out and putting in a ridgetop road, that'll be a huge impact positively for any amphibians in that area, so. You know, once the silt size is. I think we have to.
Amanda?
Yeah, I was just gonna, on the distribution, should we turn that into a question? But I guess I don't know if the question is just what is the distribution?
Where
Yeah,
are
what's the
they?
distribution now? I would think,
Yeah.
Covered species.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Pollination and everything. Habitat. So maybe a quick thumbs up, down on, again, I think the buffers, roads, steep slopes, those are sort of the most potential impact points with a question mark. We don't know, but it would make sense probably, and we've been given some direction. Unless Megan feels differently.
The only thing I would say is if we're giving them in order, I think you need to figure out the distribution before you figure out,
Yes,
okay.
I agree.
Yeah.
I just wanted to point out that there is sort of an order that these need to go in that's bothering me.
Sure, yeah.
Thanks, Sarah.
Makes sense.
Can we put all of those on a new page, maybe?
Yeah. I'm like.
Just to like separate them from the other.
Screen break.
Yeah. Okay. I agree, yes, but starting with the distribution, maybe even like a little one and a two, the other one will be. Oh. Wendy?
I am, I'm still a little concerned about the idea of comparing pre and post PFA management, because I kind of think I'm looking at the report that the goal is simply to see if the rules are effective for these species. And I was looking at again through this prioritize 2 species to say they could include more. But to me, it should not be limited to just comparing the new rules and the old rules, because that sort of suggests that you couldn't, if the new rules were inadequate, that you couldn't say, wait a minute, we need to have additional protections. Like when I'm reading through the report, it says there's uncertainty. We don't know enough about these amphibians to be taking their situation into account and coming up with a new rule. So I'm a little resistant on this comparing. I mean, that might be additional information to be useful to know, but it strikes me that's a little more like effectiveness monitoring. I mean, the base question is more like, how do we come up with rules that protect these species? And are the current rules adequate? To me, that's a different question than like sort of an effectiveness monitoring question of whether or not that they're better off after the new rules. They might be better off after the new rules, but still the rules would not be adequate for a sustainable population of these species. So I'm not saying we can't keep that in there, but I would like to somehow have a recognition that their core goal is to make sure that the rules are adequate for these species, given that at the time of the report, there wasn't enough known to necessarily come up with rules that were ideal for these species.
I do think.
I didn't think I said it very clearly, so.
No,
Someone.
Yeah, so. Teams, some of that. Question 2, compare primary sites with post FPA management. You could just add reference sites there, which would probably, studies law, national forest, and reference sites. But I think we just kind of want to be about more about the more management regimes, the better. State forest management is also there, and that's kind of in between private forest management and kind of the more touch approach that's predominated on a lot of federal lands. Or if we're very light touch, it's on the federal land, so I think if we wanna broaden this, we can broaden that to do it, yeah, more management. Yeah, additional the better. I think we get to what you're doing, but also get to what Amanda wants, which is, you know, how has it improved, which I do think is an important question.
Yeah, I'm fine with it. I'm
I
fine
would
with
know
yes
what
and
we got and
share.
more of.
Yeah.
We can get that by looking at, we have to have a way to disentangle climate signals. Just, you know, did a disease come through, you know, that kind of stuff, and the only way we can do that is by looking at reference sites. That, situation.
The legacy.
I have I am a legacy, yeah, so it's not on this subject, that's on the question of the steep slopes and the roads.
You have a comment?
No, I think we got it.
Okay, so I would be remiss if I didn't channel a colleague and say that the disconnected Simpson Springs question needs to also be in there if we're gonna add another thing that we should be looking at. So I guess maybe it's incorrect to say focus on, because focus on is like prioritize and you get a list of things. That's not really, at least it's not super intentional language. So yeah, consider the riparian buffer roads, steep slopes, and disconnected seeps and springs. And part of that is that there's, correct me if I'm wrong, people, hopefully you will, there's not a lot of protections of disconnected seeps and springs, right?
You mean just soggy spots on the hillside that
Yeah.
never connect to the stream?
Yeah, or that wouldn't be connected by the US Supreme Court's decision, so with that.
I wonder.
And it's my colleagues that they don't, how about that?
If framing it under habitat condition maybe works for folks, because I mean, yes, I think that's where we would have questions and be interested in research, but maybe there's other components besides seeps and springs that maybe Sarah, sorry.
No, this is great, yeah.
Disconnected seeps and springs, if you could, in front of that, just put habitat conditions and
I have with that is if it's not a current forest practice rule, why are we adding it in the current forest practices section? Isn't that something that would come out of potential information if you were to do status and trend population monitoring? You might see that they're in these seeps and springs and they potentially need to get protected, but I think we're putting the cart before the horse by including this specifically in an analysis of forest practices when you're saying that it's not a rule related question.
I mean, it is a rule, well. It's associated with covered activities though, right? And the amphibians that are living in seeps and springs are associated with covered activities. So in terms of the habitat conservation plan, they should be considered.
is another way to think about it. Sort of like putting that in the bucket of the buffer prescriptions, that would be. I mean, just in terms of thinking, if we're looking at it with the lens of Forest Practices Acts, then how seeps and springs are managed or not, managed for or not, would fall in that bucket. Right? Just, I'm trying to find that.
Yeah. And part of it is that if we don't have it in there, then they're not going to be measured, right? And if we don't have them in there, they're never been measured, so there's never going to be any consideration of whether there's a population there that may need or may not need to be protected. And so it really is if we don't have a rule, so we're not gonna look, then we're never gonna have a rule to protect that. And then thus we're gonna struggle to have a persistence of populations. And those are all lots of caveats in there, but I do wanna make sure that we're not disregarding important habitats on the landscape simply because they're not in a riparian zone.
Oh, Amanda was ahead of me.
I don't know the answer to this question, which is why I'm asking it.
Hey, I asked you to just a moment ago, I'm with you.
Do we have a comprehensive geospatial data of seeps and springs?
I doubt it.
It's
physically possible.
If we don't, then we would be probably requiring field, field folks to go out and. I mean, that's fine, that's what we want, right? They're gonna walk up and down every single hillside looking for seeps and springs then. I'm just wondering if that's.
Well, if we're not relying on the current forest practices rules to look at the persistence of amphibians, I would like to add another whole new category which says smaller buffers than we currently.
I think that's what we have, the right, pre-PFA, it's in there.
I think we could go beyond that. I think we can make them smaller than pre-PFA.
I'm just curious about how that's, I mean, I think it's covered in here. Do you not think that it's covered? Because there were like literally whole sections that didn't have buffer, right?
Well, you're talking about NP streams, but we could be talking about fish riparian buffers as well. So maybe smaller SSBT buffers. I'm just saying, if we're going to go beyond forest practices and add seeps and springs, I think we need to look at this in some other ways.
Well, but if we're talking right now about torrent salamanders, and we're not really talking about SSBT, right? They don't co-occur.
Did we make a decision whether or not we were just?
Yeah, I'm not sure we made a decision about torrents, and I want to hit a little bit of a pause because I think we were getting close to something that was constructive, and we don't have to decide this today. And also, hopefully we'll have a work group. I wonder if seeps and springs fits under the distribution question, maybe the habitat condition, maybe there's another way to look at it, because I think what we're trying to understand. And I asked a question on the field tour about that, whether the researchers were looking and identifying seeps and springs, and it may just be, we don't, to your point, Amanda, really like know where they are. I guess maybe there's a way to build in more of that information that still fits in the structure. So. Here, that's more of a sub question or a question to be considered as we continue to develop this.
So I think what you're saying is taking this to the work group because you're not making final decisions today.
Right.
But this is brainstorming, narrowing, recognizing that the narrowing isn't complete, but the work group can discuss some of these things. Bring it back for comprehensive discussion later.
And maybe get a little more thought to that.
Yeah, I think that whatever our next step is really important. We keep looking at the section of the report on this because it really does lay out some considerations that we're talking about verbally now. So the working group, I think, should really use that as a starting point because those are issues that have already been pinned down.
Well, I guess maybe looking at 1 and 2, we're not voting on anything today, but I'm excited to see that we have some narrowed down potential question list. Do folks feel like, given there's still more conversation to have and thinking around this, is this a good place to pause the conversation today? Move this to a working group? Is this enough to sort of continue to build out, or do we want to use a little more time to keep talking through what this could look like? I would propose that we pause now,
It's like, what is-
since I think we were getting to a constructive place, and I also know this group loves to deep dive on specific things, but it may be best use of time to do a work group and come back with a little more language on these. Any volunteers? Be part of any of the.
Yeah, I'll be in a
work group?
group.
I have like more of a
Yes.
general question. And we don't need to answer it right now. This, so, our packages so far have included many research questions, right? And I think how the rules were initially drafted, it almost implied that there would be a research question, right? And like one package per research question. And we've been doing one research package with many research questions.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how far we go on this and in the continuation of these, right? Because there's sort of, one research question here with the distribution, and then there's the second with like many sub questions underneath it. And from a practical perspective, would we be creating kind of research packages or whatever, right? For each one of those sub questions? I'm just, just thinking about how we've sort of been going about all of these thus far. Just kind of putting that out there of like, at what point, and maybe we won't know this until we really get to that process of developing the research agenda and the budget, piece, and you might start realizing, oh crap. We can't do all this, right? And just this one research question alone is gonna be $1 million, whatever. Totally outside of where I should be, but anyways, just something as we go into the subgroup or working group to kind of flesh these things out. I think that there needs to be more brainstorming, and we need to get some more focus and some more pointed questions, right, that can be researched. But I don't know, I've just been thinking about that a lot too.
I mean, just in terms of constraints from rules, it doesn't differentiate, like, you can only do one question at a time, but it does kind of, I think there's some gray area of like, it doesn't make sense to lump a roads question with the steep slopes question. That kind of does, I'm sorry, that's apples and elephants, it just doesn't mix. But if you're talking about sort of some questions about amphibians, there's an argument, well, they should be lumped together, and there's argument they should be split apart. And to a certain extent, that's up to you folks. What is an elegant thing to do to forward on to the IRST? Because if you have too many sub questions, then it gets to be, and I'll check in with Sean here in a moment to chime in on that from the INR supporting the IRST and even Jessica about what is too much from a perspective, just the practicalities of developing a scoping proposal and then RFPs. So those are some things that we might not know today, but in terms of what's constricted by rule strictly, to answer your question. Hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah.
Sean, Jessica, if you want to chime in on what Amanda and I were just conversing about.
Yes, that the kind of very strict interpretation of the rules where every question requires a research proposal is causing us some challenges at the moment. Hopefully we can figure out how to mitigate that somehow, move away from that. Perhaps, like the steep slopes question had one overarching question and then 2 sub questions, which could strictly be interpreted as we have to produce 3 research proposals, but those questions are all very interrelated. So it would be, I think, serve all of our purposes if we could just produce one research proposal. Perhaps it had some variations for, answering the different nuances between the questions. Jessica, do you? Anything
Yeah,
from
I
your
think,
perspective?
yeah, I think that's a good point to bring up, Sean. I mean, the way we've been discussing it is, can we have a single proposal that, certain sections of it tie back to what we might call a sub-question? Perhaps the same with the literature review too. So, I mean, it's a challenging space, right? We're kind of developing this as we go. But to bring it back to this conversation, I'm just looking what I see here on the screen about how do forest practices affect the persistence of these amphibian populations. In my mind, that could be the question, and then everything underneath, those are sort of the how we get to the answers of the question that the IRST develops. If we think about what persistence might mean, for example, that's where we're pulling in some of these other ideas about demographics. That could be a mechanism to help us understand persistence, things like that. So I don't want to get too far off in the weeds. But I do agree kind of with what Sean's saying, what Terry's saying is there is some value to being less less detailed and fewer related questions.
And perhaps if we could just break things up, as you're thinking about things, where do you really want a separate research proposal? And perhaps we could break things up as, here's our research question, and then here's a number of sub-questions or sub-considerations. And then I assume that would be fine with the rules because you'd be defining this is the research question. So that's what you want a proposal for, and if that's the only one, one proposal is sufficient.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about what Amanda said, and then it was also helpful, like Gordon and Jessica and everyone said, because I was thinking the same thing, that I think we have the power just to say, like I said earlier, I kind of like the idea of framing what our goal is and then saying, this is our question to you. In addition, are some additional points we suggest you consider. So those sub-questions be more in the way of the things that we have thought of, we are suggesting they'll look into, but we aren't saying we need a proposal on these. And that also, maybe we want the benefit of the IRST to do the nitty-gritty work anyway. But I think our input in these sub-points is helpful as well.
Great. Well, I guess maybe then that's a question. It still seems like a working group would add value to add maybe a little more color, even if those are the bigger questions. Like, I don't think looking at this, we'd be ready to vote on these questions at a next meeting, right? Okay. So then I do think it would be valuable to have a working group, but Megan and Terry may disagree. Megan?
Seth Barnes also thinks it would be valuable to have a working group and get volunteering for it.
Actually, like, are you going to speak?
I'm just gonna say that, from this, looking at the rule, what the package of information that goes with the question is, the type of research or monitoring question, divided into rule, the rule or BGOs or issues being studied, and the objective of the research. So there's this contextual information that's been sent with each question. And so that sort of, there's still value for the working group to have some conversation, flesh that out as a draft to be considered as an entire package of material that gets sent to the IRST. Whether or not you stick with one question or two here, that's up to you folks. But some of those sub considerations could be as parts of the contextual information.
Yeah, and the way that was really helpful to hear from Sean and Jessica about how they might be grappling with these, because I know many of us are not spending our time going to these meetings and watching their meetings, although some of us may tune in every once in a while. I think what Terry just outlined, that, we can have one question, or maybe it's one question and a sub question or something like that, but then in the contextual piece that, what are your objectives of this research? We can identify like, we're curious about X, Y, and Z and would like to know more about these things. And these are some of the questions that we've thought of. And maybe that's how we frame it, right? And that's where I agree the working group can maybe think about those pieces. So it's maybe not coming up with 10 research questions or 2 research questions and each with 3 sub questions, but really thinking about qualifying the objective, perhaps.
So I've got Seth, the Megan, and PC had volunteered. There's at least one more person able to online.
Stacy, I can help out if you need another volunteer.
I was just gonna ask if Jason could, so hooray, thanks, Jason.
So we've got Seth, PC, Jason. I think the goal would be to before the December meeting, thinking add a little more detail. I like how you frame that, Amanda, with, rather than sub questions, maybe these are like objectives for the research or things we're thinking about. Just helping to add a little color to those 2 bigger questions. Great, well, thanks everyone for the productive amphibians conversation. I think we got further on that than we were expecting, which is great. And folks are doing okay. I would like us to end a little early, if we can, maybe. So we're gonna set that as a goal. And shift gears to the effectiveness monitoring, and I would love folks from that working group. I know Josh and Wendy. Dave, what's the other person? Yeah. If maybe they could just walk us through, I know we've all gotten the document, but just to help refresh our memory around your thoughts and spend a little bit of time, maybe if there's some questions or conversation on that.
Do you want to pull up that document or
Yes, that
to
would
the
be great.
effectiveness monitoring document? Yeah. So you've got it open, so at the top.
This is the document.
Yes, yes.
That's for help.
There you go. Just leave part of it. Excellent. Zoom in a little bit.
So yeah, if we could maybe have the 2 of you add a little detail to your thinking or just walk us through it. And we can spend a little bit of time talking about it, but with the caveat that plan is for revisiting this in December, a little more context around the HCP. So we won't be voting or making a decision on this, and strongly recommend we don't spend too much time wordsmithing this as a group, just given. You put your.
And I think what we talked about is pretty clear just from looking at this document. Basically, the working group was itself looked at a bunch of models of effectiveness monitoring. And so they looked through those and thought about what was on offer and from them selected 4, which include like the Washington Fish and Forests monitoring effectiveness monitoring plan, and the Northwest Forest Plan effectiveness monitoring plan, and then a couple others. And there are some common components to these in terms of approaches and just things like, how they pick out sample watersheds and things like that. And some of those considerations, like but the way this document works, at first we just say, you recommend some kind of approach, because they're starting with kind of a broad question, like, given that the AMP is supposed to come up with an effectiveness monitoring program, we don't really ourselves know how to do that other than providing some guidance. We're asking the IRS to essentially just suggest an approach. And like we were talking before, since we don't right now have the agency guidance and what they're looking for, we thought this was a broad way of just starting down the road on this point. And we put in the document some of our, there's specific things to look at, like demographics, water quality, et cetera. We talked about approaches that would be looking at whether or not the sort of on the ground changes were happening, like in terms of the, specifics for like, disconnection and so forth. And then also looking at species presence and healthiness of those populations. So those are the kinds of things that we saw in these examples that we looked at. And then sort of turned that into this question, these questions for the IRST, which is helping us choose a strategy and then mentioning some things we think that would look at as well. But I'll turn it over to Josh for additional thoughts.
So yes, I think you covered most of it, Wendy. Some of what we have on there was just sort of like study design considerations. And then we'll look at avoiding duplication. Academic research, like by that, so our effectiveness monitoring is probably something that's heavily researched. Yeah, I think that's that. I mean, like most of the work has been done by the IRST. Study design criteria, but would be important. And, you know, I think it's in the document basically. We talked about some of it in the context of amphibians, like, you know, we want to observe conditions like large numbers, what's kind of that versus direct. This is, you know, design. Here's what.
Questions? Thoughts? Thank you both and Dave for your work on this. Anyone online?
Online, thoughts or questions about this, Rick, Jason?
I think these are all great starting points. So, thank you for taking.
Yeah, I think we were wanting to constrain. They don't do this. We definitely things to look at, but you know, but also different. Their expertise. Pretty much. I don't think that the particularly new area, there's a lot of this monitoring for HCPs going on. You know, in Washington State. In addition to having not seen what's going into the HPP under effectiveness monitoring, which would need to be included in this, we also was having the background retention example that services have looked at, which is the Western Oregon State Forest HCP effective monitoring plan. So I think that's, you know, farther ahead of the process. What happened there as well.
Yeah, and I think I'm just thinking of your thing, right? But in terms of the HCP, the biological goals and objectives, there are now some metrics in there of some variables. And I think this just complements it really well from what I've seen here.
I may have been gone for this, but with this letter, what exactly are we expecting from IRST? Are we expecting them to answer each of these questions, to craft some narrative, you know, around this and send it back to us? Like, what is the expectation?
Thoughts from drafters?
I'm just curious.
We tried to have the first 3 points, like you recommend an approach. Yes, we want them to come back and say, we looked at these, we like number 2, and we think number 10 that you didn't look at is the best. We want them to come back and make a proposal as to approach. And so then we point out that we provided some examples and we asked, do you like any of these in the model? So the same thing. And then we say we provided the biological goals and objectives, and do they have any specific input on how to put those into the system? And then after that, we just say, you know, Steve's part. So the first three are kind of mandatory questions, but they're basically all the same one, which is, do you recommend an approach? And do you like what we provided, or do you see another approach being better? That makes sense? Or-
That makes sense. I'm wondering if that is the case, then do we muddy the waters by including the brainstorming questions? Should those be questions saved for a future conversation, or? I'm just wondering what the benefit is.
Right, so I would imagine this is going to be a process. And so I think those are the way I view those are sort of must-haves to answer in a strategy design. It's getting them out there up front gives the IRT an opportunity to say, you forgot some design principles, or you included design principles that aren't necessary. And then also it's like gives them a chance to know what it is, what kind of design specifics are that we think are important up front, so that we can maybe have less rounds. Because we are gonna have rounds back and forth on this, but these are things that looked at. So yeah, these have to go into it. An effectiveness monitoring strategy for it to be adequate. And I think the federal services would say the same thing. We're assuming back and forth, but we want to get this in place sooner rather than later. So if we can, be a little more specific about what we're thinking earlier on, then that might save us some downside. After that.
Completely, and I think the input from us is sort of important, because we're just saying, this is where we're coming from, and they come back and say, we were really off base there. But since we're going to be saying whether or not we move ahead with what they come up with, I think it's sort of helpful for them to know where we're coming from initially. And if they need to reorient this, so much better. Or they come back and they like it, that's good too. So that's why I think it is important to include this addition.
Oh.
Yeah. I was.
I think there's unlike the research questions, there's nothing that's like, here's the rule for this, here's the rule for this. So I appreciate you putting a little bit more on it, and I think that going back to the HCP, it's going to be very helpful. I think this will be very helpful, and Jennifer's on here to have this process started.
Yeah, and I will add that to a certain extent, this letter is a little bit of a reminder to us, because we did spend the time looking through like 6. And on some level, these were the thoughts that were prompted, and sometimes it's helpful just to have some sort of written record, and sharing it might be a good idea, but for us to I remember those were the 3 key things that were in that Washington Forest-ish thing, so I think it could be helpful on several levels.
Just like to say that this was a lot of work. It shows because you were very thorough and your questions are thorough, and I really like the 4 effective monitoring strategies that you picked, and I'm very familiar with at least 2 of them from my work in Washington State. So good job picking out some of the best. I'm excited to watch from the sidelines on where this goes and what you do with it, and look forward to the tie-ins with the adaptive management. Whatever the chapter is called in HCP, that will help, I think, flesh out some of these questions and the space that you get to work in with chapter 6. So this really, wherever you take this, the really positive step to move things forward. And I think, like Josh said earlier, you don't necessarily want the IRST to reinvent the wheel when you've already spent all of this time on a really good project.
Just one suggestion, maybe we can add some additional clarification in the topic sentence above the brainstormed questions. It kind of is just like this is why I had the question. It just says below are some other types of potential questions and requests. And so it's almost like, oh, well, do you want us to answer those now or not?
This is incomplete. This was sort of a draft for, and so this, I think that one was that statement is probably should have been more like a comment, like, hey, do we all want to include every single one of these bullet below, so.
It might be better seeing.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Or below our some design consideration.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
I think that's a good point.
Yeah, I think that's why I got.
Yeah.
good point.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, for the internet.
Want them to brains.
Yeah.
Yeah, like policy people. I don't think it's gonna air like that.
That might be better.
Develop the awareness.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Design.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, thank you all again for the work on this. It definitely sets us in a good place. And it's nice. I mean, I think we set this working group up quite a while ago, so I appreciate continuing to make progress on it as we have to work through some of the other ones as well.
Yeah, well, I think we were pretty helpful. Currently out, but for sure. It's moving. It's scheduled.
So,
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think that's probably a good place to stop on this one. We'll pick this back up in December. If anything changes on timing as far as we're not gonna have the information we thought, we'll share that out through Terry as soon as we know. But the plan at this point would be having Jennifer come to speak about the chapter 6 and then be able to share that excerpt from the chapter. And keep the good momentum there. So I think.
so we're, that's pretty much, just to kind of wrap up here, I'll work with the amphibians work group, Casey, Jason, and set up a meeting and kind of keep that moving along. And I mentioned the draft agenda for next time. So that's pretty much it. I want to just hand the floor over to Casey.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Harry, we, this last week, we lost a dear friend in the, conservation and forestry and PFA community. When Bob Salinger, who was the longtime conservation director at Audubon, Portland Audubon, died unexpectedly in his office. And, he's an author in my world. He
Hard
was
to
like,
have this conversation because we were just always
Yeah.
handling Bob on amphibians and.
it's still not real to me, and so it felt like it was important for you all to know. He was our, he's sitting there with Adrian Miller, negotiating and figuring out how to talk about amphibians for state analysis, among the many, many things that he did in his life and was working on just
People
when he
learning
died.
about.
Yeah.
Legacy and just like, I'm to get.
If you all can think about how, I don't know, it's just like all of you do lots of things too, and it's amazing to me how much of an impact you have on so many people in so many places. And maybe just for your own lives, think about that yourselves, that like you are literally changing the face of this place, in addition to the rest of the people you interact with. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey.
Jennifer,
Yep. Bob will be missed. He is a
Thank
key
you.
partner in our HCP project.
Folks are interested, if we learn more about a memorial or ways to support, it's really happy to share that. Thank you all.
Yep.
Appreciate the time. Is there anything else, Terry, we need to do?
Nope, I think we can conclude. Rick or Jason, anything?
No, I think we can conclude. I'm pleased to announce, though, I will be in person for our December meeting, so I'll be excited to see everybody.
Great, glad to hear that.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks all.
thank you.
Maybe kind of early.
Yes.
And or
Yeah.